So as mentioned, my name is Danah Abdulla. I'm the Program Director of Graphic Design at Camberwell, Chelsea, Wimbledon at University of the Arts. And I always like to start with this image here just to kind of tell you that despite the fact that what I'm going to talk about may seem big, it's still a bit lighthearted. So my talk is called Against Performative Positivity, a Designerly Ennui. Months out of the game, you need some practice with the microphones. So I'm considered a pessimist, the Daria of design, whose standards are too high and is too critical. Designers, I would argue, are afraid to embrace dissent because it disrupts the positivity bubble. I would describe designers as the very embodiment of the motivational posters typeset in bad typefaces that we constantly critique. We are performing optimism, and I am anti-optimism. So why am I against optimism? Optimism should not be mistaken for hope. As Barbara Ehrenreich states, hope is an emotion, a yearning, the experience of which is not entirely within our control. Optimism is a cognitive stance, a conscious expectation, which presumably anyone can develop through practice. And I refuse to practice it, because optimism in design hinders the politicization of designers. If design is going to contribute to anything positive, it must begin to embrace pessimism. For a profession whose purpose is allegedly transformative problem solving, featuring an array of manifestos on what we can do to change the world, design solutions are incredibly conservative. We continue to populate the world with junk, and have become complicit in designing people into a culture of convenience. Convenience is the most underestimated and least understood force in the world today. All around the world, convenience, more efficient and easier ways of doing personal tasks, has emerged as perhaps the most powerful force shaping our individual lives and our economies. Convenience seems to make our decisions for us, trumping what we like to imagine are our true preferences. Easy is better, easiest is best. While convenience has its benefits, it also has a dark side. It makes us lazy, spoiled by immediacy, a fact that we are witnessing right now amidst the pandemic. Designers contribute to creating a lonely, materialistic, and competitive world. Look at all the wonderful things we've come up with in relation to interactions of conveniences. One-click purchases, read receipts, ways of measuring anything, multi-purpose devices. Why are we praising these devices when we don't ever mention how poorly it has replaced other objects and how often we are expected to replace the shiny, expensive devices? Thank you. We are triggering new emotions and desires in consumers rather than imagining different ways of living. Again, look at our inability to imagine anew when we have been given an opportunity amidst the pandemic. The slogan from May 1968, Soyez réaliste, demandez l'impossible, should be design's call to action. The outdated definition of design as problem solving is at odds with this call to action. I define design not as a solution-oriented, problem-solving discipline, but as a realm of possibilities that acknowledges that there are alternatives to these possibilities and alternatives to the alternatives. Here is the connection with emancipatory politics, which are meant to make what is deemed impossible seem possible. As many have written, the current political climate landscape was once thought unthinkable, is now our reality. It's easy to think that politics has no place in design, that design is banal and inconsequential. Arrive at the design section of any bookshop and you are welcomed by an anti-intellectual assortment of books that demonstrate design is only about style, grids, the celebrity designer artist, and clever one-liners. It is as though you've mistakenly wandered into the self-help section. What if these shelves demonstrated the extent of the discipline? What if they showed that design is not a neutral, isolated, or value-free activity, but a transdisciplinary practice? Designers give form to function, and since no mass-produced items are neutral, all are ideological containers, creating the form for the function, designers validate the product, the process, and the ideologies behind this object, as Adam Richardson states. So once these works go out into the world, their meaning is out of the designer's hands, similar to Umberto Eco's notion of the open work, where design objects do not have a fixed meaning or ending, nor are their functions static. But they are constantly changing based on the multiplicity of meaning and user interpretation. A trip I took to Paperchase, which is a UK stationery chain, revealed the low level of awareness amongst designers in the ideology they instill in their creations. The collection features an assortment of notebooks and materials with trendy slogans such as "the future is female" and other bite-sized motivational messages that reduce the seriousness of the message. I can imagine designers calling the stationery empowering to young girls, but in reality, the desire for emancipation starts to look like something wholly interchangeable with the desire simply to buy more things, as Nina Power argues. These products will quickly join the 70% off bargain bin once the next trend kicks in. Feminism is reduced to a series of trendy slogans plastered on poorly designed stationery. The ubiquity of political slogans on merchandise resonate with Mark Fisher's description of capitalism, which he compares to the thing in John Carpenter's film, a monstrous, infinitely plastic entity capable of metabolizing and absorbing anything with which it comes into contact. Neoliberalization has transformed everything into a product or an experience. But these seemingly harmless pieces of design living on the shelves of Paperchase are considered non-political, and yet they are very much the opposite. Political wokeness has been capitalized by consumerism. When it seems like every brand is progressive, is ethical and moral, i.e. it is sustainable, it has equal representation of men and women, it supports LGBTQ rights, it is feminist, it is against racism, and features just enough people of color, people assume there is equality and there is nothing left to protest. Optimism then renders a designer's political action as just another one of these experiences. As I have described elsewhere, one only needs to look at the increase of trips to work in disadvantaged communities and make a difference that are accompanied by a hefty price tag. You too can do good and be political if you can pay the exorbitant fees. Our doing good appears to be motivated by the kind of person we want to be. James Andreoni calls this the warm glow of giving, rather than a concern for the poor. This means that designers want everyone to be aware about the act of doing good. Designers doing good, or being political, have adopted what Mark Fisher calls the caring individual syndrome, which he traces to the arrival of Live Aid 1985, where philanthropy and We Are the World chants could end famine and poverty without the need for political action or systemic reorganization. Capitalism is the only way, and consumerism is buying the right product. We are, after all, what we consume. To take this further, we might think, I give to charity. I was stopped by someone with a clipboard on the street and I gave them money. But this is not political participation. It is paying someone else to do the work for you. This, as Stephen Duncombe states, circumscribes the playing field of politics, disconnecting potential activists from political activity. The disappearance of money from your bank account every month discourages the creation of the very thing needed for democratic change: everyday citizen activists. Everything in the world is formed by human intention. Designed artifacts are not disembodied processes, but designed by humans, and the results of these, whether good or bad, affect everyone. The creation of certain objects produces unintended consequences. Envelop something in packaging and you create the problem of disposing of that packaging. Or, in the 21st century, make a smartphone capable of replacing a multitude of objects, manufacturing new needs and desires, and you create the problem of the culture of convenience. What we design has consequences on the world. Designers pretend to know this by discussing sustainability, but we only talk about refusing to use one-day Amazon delivery, investing in a keep cup, or buying green products. We do not question consumption itself. To be sustainable is to acknowledge the material and immaterial consequences of the designer's practice and the implications on the world and the world within that world, to quote Anne-Marie Willis and Tony Fry. The urgency of this is highlighted in the events of this past year. In design education, many educators encourage their students to think of social, political, and economic issues in their projects, but they do not equip them with the language to begin asking important questions and partake in truly meaningful work. Problems are complex, but design educators want to make them simple. That is why design is all about the toolkit, and design thinking is condensed to a few steps. The complexity requires an engagement with different disciplinary, conceptual, theoretical, and methodological frameworks. But optimistic designers think asking hard questions is over-intellectualizing, when in fact it is practicing critical thinking. Interestingly, any discussion of criticality in design is never promoted as going against the grain, but that operates in parallel, despite the fact that design education is meant to be transformative. Here is another obstacle to change. We moan about not having power, we moan about design being backwards, yet we contribute to it by failing to imagine how things can be otherwise. Within design, there is a lack of recognition of perspectives and alternatives beyond the dominant frame. The use of the word transformative applies only to the development of the identity and voice of the individual designer. But transformative means conjuring up seemingly impossible scenarios of what design could be collectively. To effect any societal change, design needs politics. A politicized designer is a collective designer, and designing is not an activity done by one person. If designers want to partake in meaningful change and alter the direction of what we do, it is about understanding and addressing power. Race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, and how these intersect. It is about questioning the notion that design is universal, and who dictates what is universally good design, and who created the standard in the first place. Tackling these questions requires a move away from the current specialized disciplinary structure in design. It requires an unsettling of power and challenging what is deemed common sense. Design remains trapped in specialization when what is needed is a more general approach towards education and practice. I am not arguing against specialization, but caution against what Moholy Nagy describes as a strictly vocational design education that turns to the quick breeding of specialists with a rather narrow horizon. Design education requires a broad scope, and without exposure to other disciplines that share a culture with design, designers will continue to speak and design for themselves. Despite discussions on the dissolution of traditional disciplinary boundaries, design is becoming more sectarian. The number of different design disciplines across universities and design sectors demonstrate this. The old divisions of graphic, product, interior, and fashion have been joined by interaction, interface, UX, spatial, transition design, etc. These descriptions do not propose anything radical, nor do they step outside institutional boundaries. They are marketing tools that remain within the same design rhetoric, the same instrumental model of design. Additionally, to encourage dissent or transformation in design and the challenges we choose to address, we continue to look at the same references: 20th century solutions for 21st century problems. Designers like to think of themselves as activists, as radicals, as nonconformists, but the designer ailment is conformity. To rephrase Maura Mahoney, design activism is self-consciously pursued, but inevitably condensed to a prefabricated look, a look that has already been designed. Furthermore, the traditional resistors have either made their peace with design or have outdated political goals. The guardians of the famous phrase, "it is what it is," represented to me by the shrug emoji symbol, and unfortunately have made their way into the academy. Design's conservative marriage to its disciplines will not enable students to address larger problems, no matter how much programs and studios pay lip service to it. Take one class in design activism and you will help solve homelessness, but without discussing power and social structures. Activism and politics require time. Time designers are working against. Our world is all about instantaneous decision-making, and we have no time to sit and think critically. We have lost the time to think. Designers, due to the nature and speed of industry, have never been allocated the time to think, and perhaps this is where we begin to contribute to solving the pressing problems we've contributed and continue to contribute to creating. Being political is an add-on, something that is tolerated as long as it is a side passion project. Designers must be prepared to invest time when getting involved in causes. At the moment, designers show interest in a concern, get involved in a cause, as long as it does not conflict with their career, their class, their privilege, etc. Politics almost always happens within safely administered routines and spaces where political desire can appear but not translate into political transformation. Indeed, the types of causes designers choose to get involved in are safe. They do not raise any eyebrows. Interestingly, we see more support for the politics of decolonization, but there are many who do not see the conflict of supporting decolonial discourse and being neutral on Palestine, where the experience of dispossession and landlessness typical of settler colonialism is a central issue. Indeed, as Matt Keim states in reference to design activism, what is important is not branding something as activism, but what someone stands for, who they stand with, and what this means in practice. How do we participate politically as designers beyond making a campaign? Even then, we are incapable of practicing the very profession we engage in on a day-to-day. When it comes to politics, we are bad at branding, bad at advertising, bad at persuasion. Look at most efforts put towards educating people to wear masks, keep their distance, and wash their hands. These are all examples from the UK. Yet when it comes to our clients, we personalize and tap into people's desires and dreams, as Stephen Duncombe reminds us. Where is the emotion, the dreaming, the possibilities? We act out the old world of design rather than imagining it otherwise. Designers must move away from this positive, optimistic attitude that denies the place of any negativity, an attitude that denies realism. Optimism forces people to blame themselves for their own failures and misery, to never look at the structures of power that contribute to this. You just didn't try hard enough, and you weren't good enough. This has depoliticized the world. This self-congratulatory culture will get nowhere without establishing a strong culture of criticism. To engage with the world around us and to become design dissenters, we must think of being a living example of our politics and to incorporate it into our identity as designers. We should move away from creating instruments of control and into producing objects of agency that question. That is, designing alternative forms of political and economic organizing. All this to say is that pessimists do have a place in design, because pessimism is not without hope. So, to pessimists everywhere, pump up the volume. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danah. I have a question, so I still invite everyone to ask the questions if they have them. So from your talk emerged that designers are trying to be everything at the same time. So what do you think are the essential figures that a designer should collaborate with in order to avoid having a narrowed way of thinking?
It's an interesting question. I think that there's, I guess to kind of draw on the talk that we had this morning, Sylvia's talk, is this idea that designers need to work with a multitude of people, but at the same time they need to first understand the context in which they're working and the different sort of, the relationships that have to be formed and what the actual problem, let's put it that way, what the actual problem is. I think right now we just look at it from a purely design perspective. And for graphic designers, that's usually sort of at the end where you have to communicate something, and then you'll just put in as someone who has to design a campaign. You're not really involved in that entire process. But actually, the way that designers think, where you're trained to think differently and look at different possible scenarios, is very valuable to larger problems. So our main issue is that we just look at it purely from a design perspective. We don't see the different issues that make up this problem. And I think that's more of an education issue rather than say, okay, who do we have to work with? How do we get designers to think about who are the actual stakeholders within this? You know, if you look at the way design is taught from different colleges, whether engineering or architecture and design or in the art school, you know, there's the designer as author, which is very much the individual, rather than looking at the user. And I think particularly within graphic design, we don't really see the user as someone that we engage with, which is really bizarre, because actually we're communicating something. So why is it that we're ignoring the user? I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's sort of like a long way of going about it.
I'm also curious about how do you teach aesthetics then?
Oof. How do you teach aesthetics? Could you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, like my doubt is it's important to teach designers of a proper acknowledging the decision making, or the process of designing and working on the projects in a very responsible way, and being acknowledged of what is the outcome of the project. But at the same time, we still we understand when the design is a good or a bad on the aesthetics level. But then, can an aesthetically good design be also, can we accept an aesthetically good design that maybe doesn't have a strong political message?
Yeah, I mean, you could still design things that don't have political messages. I think I think that's most of design right now. I think this touches on the idea of what is good design and who gets to dictate what is good design. And I think this is a point where we just teach that based on aesthetics, based on, you know, all of the modernists and that sort of development of the grids and so on, and this is seen as, this is good design. If we go back to this sort of scenario here, I think there's, not aesthetically it's not very good, but at the same time it's not just aesthetically, it's actually, where am I supposed to be looking? What is this telling me? And this is actually the problem that I find with most graphic design graduates, is the fact that they don't understand the user, and there's no testing. So I think this is where somewhat, I think product design is a bit better, because you actually are looking at a user group, you're testing things out with them. Whereas with designers, it's like, well, you know, I've used more or less Gotham typeface. I've used infographics, which, you know, they love these little icons here, and I'm more or less communicating a message, but actually, do we see how people are reacting to this message? Are we doing that sort of work? No, we're not, because we are only teaching students kind of the final outcome rather than the process and the research bit within graphic design. So did we observe how people reacted to these? No, but we can easily see it, and I'm speaking from a UK perspective here. There's a lot of people who don't know how to wear a mask, you know, and it seems pretty straightforward, but actually, you'll have people who wear it under their nose because they think it's their mouth. They'll be sitting on the train and then they'll just take it off. And it's like, what type of situation do you really need to wear this in? And that's where the communication is lacking. The same thing with hand washing. When coronavirus first started, you had all these signs about how to wash your hands, which I found very weird, because I know how to wash my hands. I always knew how to wash my hands, but it turns out a lot of people don't, or they just don't do it. But if you actually look at the graphics, you're wondering, what is this graphic telling me? So do we communicate this via video? There's other things that we, it's not here, but the UK has this whole campaign, stay alert, control the virus, something like, I can't remember the last bit of it, because it's so immemorable. But you know, what does it mean to be stay alert and controlling the virus? And then also they had this measurement of the R, and it was just basically the same old stuff that you had for terrorism. It was, you know, red, danger, orange, semi-danger, and green were okay. And so these are really simplistic things that actually a lot of people didn't understand these pieces of communication that were going out. And that's very much a graphic design problem, because it is one maybe too focused on the aesthetics and not focused enough on how people read these things.
Does anyone have a question? We will have some questions later as well.
Okay.
I have one prepared for all of you, so thank you so much.
Thank you.